Welcome to Rise Africa's four-part webinar series, Realizing Unbound Possibilities. This series sets the stage for the 2025 Urban Action Festival presented by Rise Africa, where we'll introduce key themes and critical discussions that will shape the festival's thought journey. Join thought leaders and provocative speakers as they share powerful insights on African urban realities and the boundless potential of our cities. Together, we'll delve into topics ranging from urban dynamics and reimagining knowledge systems to the transformative power of social imagination in our cities. Each session will be recorded and made available on our platforms. Stay connected through our monthly mailer, where we'll announce upcoming topics and share key takeaways from past webinars. Engage, explore, imagine, and reimagine. We look forward to seeing you at the inaugural in-person Urban Action Festival in Cape Town from May 25th to 29th, 2025, as we explore realizing unbound possibilities through policy, research, creativity, and practice.
Niaje. My name is Ngatia. This is Timothy Arinaitwe. We are from Nairobi, Kenya. The poem we're about to do is called Ululeshu. A toast to everyone refueling our reservoirs of joy, choosing to see continuity where endings were declared. Those locking arms in the face of destitution, embracing hope with easy smiles, saying we will see this through and together. Glasses in the air for the weavers amongst us, threading care into tattered social fabric, from locality to neighborhood to area, all bound together by this magic of community, those rubbing the idea of family like balm into unfamiliar bonds. A dedication to all the dreamers, adding color to the mosaic of our present, birthing new patterns into the spaces where old techniques ran out of steam. Those rebuilding, rethinking, reloving, reusing, redesigning, rebecoming, and sketching out fresh layers onto cities that were handed to us. May our trail inspire passion in those that follow our footsteps. Asante sana.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Curry. I'm the director of the Urban Systems Unit and chair of the Rise Africa platform. Really delighted to be hosting our first Rise Africa Lead Up webinar, and really glad that you can join us on this journey towards the first in-person Rise Africa Festival, having done these virtually for the last 4 years. I really thought it was appropriate to start with Ngatia's poem because it offers just a taste of that joy that we argue we need to make African cities the places we want them to be. So just to situate us in this journey, our theme for 2025 is realizing unbound possibilities through policy, research, creativity, and practice. And as Ngatia said, we're hoping to build unfamiliar bonds across sectors and really invite people to speak across disciplines and with unfamiliar allies who can help us move the urban story forward. Today is the first of 4 webinars. The next ones will speak to ways of knowing, different knowledge systems and data to enhance urban futures. In April, we'll talk about unbound imagination. What are the possibilities that we can unlock through social creativity? And in May, just before the festival, we'll have another one on futuring and rethinking transformative urban shifts in Africa. Our photo competition and showcase is already en route, the theme being where we gather, and really wanting to look at how place shapes interactions between different people and creates possibilities and new imaginaries. In May, our festival already has a set of really fabulous provocateurs from across experiences, from urban leaders, NGOs, community mobilizers, thought leaders, and some really good troublemakers. So we hope that you will come and join in conversation with these esteemed colleagues. Today's session sets the foundation for the conversations in the rest of the webinar and at Rise Africa, really looking at African urbanization dynamics. And we have three fabulous provocateurs, Philip Heinrichs to speak to a new report on African urban dynamics that shows the macro story, how urbanization trends in Africa are changing, and what recommendations we can have for planners. Joseph Muturi, chair of Slum Dwellers International, will speak to community dynamics and who is currently building our city and how we connect these dynamics with the macro story. And Arthur Adea, longtime Rise provocateur, will provide some reflections on this tension between the planned city and the unplanned city, and reflect on how we know the city and what that means for how we can shape them. So really excited for today's conversation, and I invite everyone who's joined us to throw some questions or comments into the chat, and we'll have a few presentations and then some time for a bit of discussion. So to start us off, Philip, over to you. Looking forward to your input.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Really happy to be joining this series, and I'm going to start sharing the slides. And as Paul already said, it's work that we've done for forthcoming report, which is called Planning for Urban Expansion, and we have produced that together with the African Development Bank, UCLGA Africa, and Cities Alliance. But we also had contributions from ICLE, from Paul and his team, on a really nice piece on how to understand cities and the social equality and sustainability aspects. So the reason for the report is obviously that there is a massive urban transition going on, and everyone knows that the population projection for Africa is to almost double between now and 2050. But it's 80% of this total population growth that is going to be absorbed by cities. So there's really the imperative to start planning urban expansion now. So what we have done in this report, we used the Africa Polis database and did demographic and spatial projections for over 11,000 urban agglomeration across the 54 countries in Africa. And the particular feature is that it not only projects the demographic of cities, but also the spatial expansion. And so it provides a really the most comprehensive view of future urbanization dynamics in Africa to date. Can you see the slides, Paul?
Please share.
Can you see the slides?
No, you can share the screen.
I started. Sorry. Tell me when it's there.
Yeah, I see.
Okay. Okay, sorry. So I started talking about having the slides. My apologies. So these are the figures that I just mentioned on the demographic expansion, but then also on what it translates to into urban expansion. Here is like an animation of the growth of the urban landscape in Africa. So I'm starting with the key findings. And the first one is that Africa is going to be even more urban by 2050 than it is today. So already today, we estimate there are more than half of the total population living in an urban agglomeration, and we expect an expansion to 65%. So 2 out of 3 Africans will live in an urban agglomeration. There are going to be only 12 countries that have an urbanization level below 50% by 2050, mostly in West Africa. However, this doesn't mean that urban expansion is not an issue for each country on the continent, because it's notably the countries with the lowest level of urbanization today that see the fastest increase in their urban populations. So there's an imperative, especially in these countries, to start planning for this expansion now. One sometimes overlooked aspect of the urban expansion and growth in urban population is that we see an increasing emergence of new urban agglomerations. So between 2020 and 2050, we expect the number of urban agglomerations to increase from 9,000 to more than 11,000. And maybe a step back, when we talk about urban agglomerations, we consider continuously built up areas with more than 10,000 inhabitants. So this is irrespective of national definitions of a city, but it provides that the data is comparable across all countries of Africa and over time. We also see the emergence of more large cities, and in 2050, Africa will have 159 urban agglomerations with more than 1 million inhabitants, and also features 17 megacities with more than 10 million inhabitants, and it's going to be the second most after Asia, globally speaking. On this map, what is interesting, there are three cities that are not among the top 10 in 2020, but they're going to be there in 2050. So it's Bujumbura, Khartoum, and Luanda. Something also very interesting is that a large part of the urban expansion projected for Africa is going to be in the interior as opposed to coastal areas. So we see that the fastest agglomeration, 98 are going to be 98 of the 100 fastest agglomeration are going to be in the interior, and then also almost 2/3 of the large cities with more than 1 million inhabitants are going to be in the interior. And this is notably an aspect that is important when we think about African continental integration. So it's not only a story about port cities, but it's increasingly also to connect the interior of Africa. 2/3 of the projected total urban population growth is going to be in large cities, which we define here as cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. So by 2050, almost 59% of all urban inhabitants in Africa are going to live in one of these large cities, going up from 46% today. So it's a considerable increase. And this is notably due to the fact that large cities are also growing faster in terms of population, only slightly faster than intermediary cities, but significantly faster than small cities. And this is also something that we often hear, that it's notably the small and intermediary cities that see a large increase, but it's not confirmed by the projections that we did. And now we're going to start talking about the more spatial aspects. So until now, the projections on the demographic, they are relatively stable over time. I mean, they're going to be, like small adjustments, but this is something we definitely going to see. In terms of the spatial expansion projected, this is something there where we projected past trends. And this is also something that can be influenced more by policy, right? So we see that, first of all, that the expansion in built-up areas is going to be faster than the expansion in terms of population. But there is not a clear relationship between the two, as you see on the figure. And this notably corresponds to differences in the historic and political context of countries and how the built environment is organized. However, although we see a massive expansion in urban land area, it's still going to account for only 2% of the total African land area. So you're going to have 2/3 of the population on 2% of the land area. We also see that large and intermediary cities are growing spatially faster than the small ones. And this is because usually large agglomerations have additional infrastructure needs compared to smaller and intermediary cities. Something that is really fundamental to the projections and to this increase spatially, but also demographically, is that a lot of this expansion is driven by what we call fusion and absorption. So this is when an existing agglomeration in its expansion trajectory merges and absorbs existing settlements. So they can be cities or rural settlements. And as you see on the slide, it's like in terms of demographics, it represents more than 32% of the total population growth for large cities and more than 40% in terms of the spatial growth. So you see that the expansion is going to happen into areas that are already built, and that this is driving a significant part of the increase. Here you have an example of how this looks like. So you have Kampala and surrounded by the existing agglomerations that are currently not yet connected, but each one growing spatially and demographically. At one point, they're going to merge, and it's going to lead to a continuously built up urban agglomeration. And this is something that we see across most large cities, because usually they're already in an area surrounded by high density and large settlements in these areas. A particular feature of this spatial expansion is the formation of mega agglomerations. So this is something more rare, and the most extreme or the most spectacular case is Nairobi, that is projected to form one continuously built up area going from Nairobi to Kisumu and even extending into Uganda and merging with Mbale. So it's gonna, in 2050, we project that Nairobi is gonna be the most populous urban agglomeration in Africa with 57 million inhabitants. And this feature of the formation of mega agglomerations is more pronounced in Central Africa, Eastern Africa, the Great Lakes regions, but we also see similar trends in Nigeria, for instance. And this obviously has significant implications in terms of planning and also urban governance, right? Also, I thought I'm not going to go too much into the detail about the policy implications, but we also, beyond the projections, we also looked at what these projections and urban expansion imply for the urban planning system, for the urban governance and urban finance system. And what comes out as reuniting all three very much is there's a need for long-term strategies. So we need, given the scale and the pace of the projected expansion, to have a really good approach to managing that. Governments need to define a long-term strategy, a vision and objectives for what they would like their urban expansion to look like. We also see that the issue of land governance is crucial. It's crucial in terms of governance, obviously in terms of equality, but it's also important for the land planning system, for the urban planning system, because it's basically about access to land. But it also has a massive impact on the financing system, because investments and financing will also depend on the stability and ease of transactions and clarity of these systems. And something that is also very important is the aspect of how we deal with informality. So informality is obviously a key feature of the reality of Africa's urban landscape, and it's going to be so for the coming decades. So there is a need to better integrate informality, to better include in governance processes and participation. It's also in the planning system, how the planning system can better include informal areas and provide infrastructure and services to what is called informal areas. So I'm actually through with my presentation. Just one more slide. We're going to launch the report. So we're going to have 1.5 hours talking about the report, also more about the policy recommendations on the 6th of March, 2025. And we're going to share the link with you to register, and look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Philip. I mean, you're condensing a huge amount of information into a very quick presentation, but I think for African urbanists, this feels sort of a familiar story of the scale and scope of urbanization. What struck me as quite novel was the shift from small to intermediate cities being the fastest growing, and the attention now needing to be as well on the 1 million. But the fact that there are resources there, and how do you support the small intermediate who often don't have as many resources or human capacity to deal with this urbanization. Just to say, this then connects to this off-cited quote or reference that African cities have yet to build about 60 to 80% of their infrastructure to accommodate this growth. And that's the key provocation for this conversation, is that gives us both a daunting prospect of how we mobilize the resources to build that infrastructure, but that really phenomenal opportunity to make sure that infrastructure is inclusive, sustainable, and the many sort of buzzwords we use in this space. But how do you take charge of that and be purposeful about that conversation rather than reactionary? So if there are further questions, I know Ivan's thrown one into chat. Philip, please feel free to add into chat. We'll hold questions till the very end. But I'd like to welcome Joseph Muturi to reflect on the dynamics taking place in city, particularly with our reference to informal urbanization. So welcome, Joe, and if you could share how you engage in this conversation. Sorry, I think you're still muted. I think I muted you by mistake.
Yeah,
Here we go.
So thank you very much, Paul. And thanks on behalf of SDI, thanks for having me here. So, and I think I listened to the submissions. I think the data and the statistics are spot on. I think there's a growth. African cities are growing. Informal settlements are growing. And I think there's less investment being made in cities. And the planning and the planners, they don't have... what is being planned at the city level is not in touch with the reality on the ground in terms of informality. So number one, when we talk about planning, we must also talk about inclusion. We must also talk about inclusion. We must also talk about equity in terms of the investment being made at the city level. So there is a very intentional marginalization when it comes to service provision, when it comes to budgeting at the city level. So we are looking at spaces where there is not sufficient investment made by the city in terms of provision of the basic needs like water, infrastructure. So that's number one. The other thing, we are also very intentionally and very deliberately the planning that we are doing. We exclude this deliberate exclusion of informal settlements in the development strategies. If you look at most of the informal settlements, they are usually on wastelands, they are usually on low-lying wetlands. Some of them are reclaimed dumping sites, dumping grounds. So there's usually that inclusion. And I think for us and the work that we do, first of all, is to build the evidence. Where are these informal settlements? Where are they situated? Who owns the land? So the other thing we talk about when we talk about inclusion, we talk about planning for cities, we usually don't address the land question. How do we unlock the land question? How do you talk? So when we talk about informality, we are looking at the growth of informal settlements. How do we stop? And the way we do it and working with other cities is how do we formalize? How do we bring in services? How do we bring in infrastructure? How do we come up with policies that support informality, policies that support slum upgrading, policies that will attract more investments? How do we plan our cities that in a way they are connected to this, the informal settlements are connected to other part of the city? And the other investments that we work with other partners is also to look at the issue of, if we are looking at the city of Nairobi, if you don't address, one of the way to address is to look at the secondary cities that surround, because if you don't address these secondary cities, number one, will absorb in terms of the housing needs. If we don't plan them, these are going to be the Nairobis of the future. We'll have a problem that we, as much as we want to address the current problems that exist, we also want to look at 5 years from now, 6 years from now, in terms of what is the data telling us, what is the information telling us. And the work we do with our partners is also to look at the numbers, to look at which communities are vulnerable, to look at communities mapping who owns the land, and they prepare cities in terms of the investment. At the moment, cities are in a rush to attract investments from foreign investors. Factories are coming up, which also causes a strain on the services. And it's also compound the issue of climate. Yeah? If you look at somebody talked about the issue of carbon. So it's development at what cost? That is the other question. The other thing is looking at, we are now talking about, we are in this space, we are talking about vulnerable communities. We are looking at cities. Initially, cities used to be blamed for all the climate crises in the world, but I think there's a level of recognition that also cities are vulnerable to the climate phenomena. Cities are also, and specifically informal settlements, also face these challenges. They are the most vulnerable. So there's no way you can talk about the challenges and the risk of climate if you don't address the issue of communities living in informal settlements. We are looking at increased flooding. We are looking at increased heat. Mm-hmm. So the other thing that also compounds, you look at all the stakeholders tend to work in silos. There's that compartmentalization. You'll find that people working in the water sector, they are doing their own thing in one part of the city, the planners are doing their own thing. And that compartmentalization, we forget that cities are not compartmentalized that way, that we need stakeholders to work together. So number one, the environmental people will tell you the issue of climate and cities, it's an environmental problem. The scientists will tell you it's a scientific problem. The planners will tell you it's a planning, it's a standards issue, but we need all these stakeholders to work together. And I think we challenge our planners, our architects. Now, all these things we are calling locally led adaptation, locally led plans. For us, it just means the good old slum upgrading. It's just keeping things simple. Housing, services, and look at livelihoods. Look at, it's just the basic. Sometimes we tend to overthink. So all these things put together. So the other thing, the way people work in compartments, in silos, we are saying at the city level, we have done this very practically here in Nairobi. We work with civil society, we work with the city, we work with academia to have a land use plan for a settlement of almost 100,000 communities. And the plan is working. They have increased infrastructure, they are connected to the city, they have access to the basic services that they did. And for us was to tell all these organizations that work, everybody is doing their own little thing at their own corner. Why don't we put our resources? Why don't we put our skills? Why don't we put our resources to support the city to deal with this problem? We look at the problem of informality as the slum dwellers problem, but it's the city. Slums are part and parcel of a city. I don't know, Paul, how much time I have.
I think that paints a really good picture. Maybe we pause there. I've got a bunch of questions, and I'm sure others do.
Last but not least, when we talk about cities and climate, the climate discussion at the moment is very elitist. At the moment, we are having a C40 conference somewhere in Nairobi at the 16th floor of a fancy. How do we start localizing the climate discussion? How does it become part and parcel of the everyday discussion at the market? The effects, if you don't do this, this is going to happen. So that's the part of the work that SDI is doing. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks, Joe. I think you've given us some really fab points again on finally making that an everyday conversation about climate in cities, co-developing land use plans, and this bigger question: well, who are the planners? And a provocation that Julian May gave a while back, a long time ago, was the city's responsibility should be to deliver bulk services, and it should be the community that plans, because they are intimately familiar with that space. So I'm going to bring that question back to you in a moment. I'd like to invite Arthur to reflect on what's emerged for you through this conversation, but also that tension then between this planned city and unplanned city, and how we understand its dynamics and make decisions based on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. As I mentioned, I was going to try and pick up sketches as I was listening. So I didn't quite pick up as many as I would like, but I think I have something. So maybe I can try and share my screen. Let's see how this will work. Okay, so I'll just share the whole screen. I hope you can see my screen.
Yeah. Possible to share the there we go, got it.
Okay. So I just tried to pick up a few things. I hope they're in order because I was picking them as I was listening and just thinking through. Actually, it's very interesting, Philip's presentation on expansion. And I think one of the first things I picked up was something I did in 1998 when we were doing a low-cost housing project. This were a number of sketches I did. I think this is one of my favorite things coming soon, low-income housing from the people who brought us low income. And I look at my projections here because these are projections to 2010, and this is Nairobi. He mentioned Nairobi is really the fastest growing. That was very fascinating, Phil, for me to listen to. But I'm looking at this projection of Nairobi at 2010. Of course, we stopped at 2010 then because it was 1998, and here we are in 2025, and the city is still growing pretty fast. I also then looked very quickly at my solutions back then. By the way, I should just mention one of the things coming out of this project on low-income housing, I figured out that we can't solve this problem as architects per se. And I think it goes to what Joe is saying about the overall contributions from several sources. But these were my solutions back then. I was already beginning to think of mixed use, but you notice they're very low density because I was looking at shops below and houses above. And centralizing the housing within a market center, but it's all very low density. Then fast forward to sketches that I am actually doing of the city in 2022. And suddenly what used to be 4-story, 3-story, which is how, as in our training, we were trained to thinking about, and you suddenly have this 18, 19, 20-story structures in a plan that wasn't really planned to take that. But sketching from life, and I know that's one of the things we were talking about in looking at these two intermediate things, sketching from life begins to open out some of these things for you. And I've done this over a couple of times. Then I think this was late last year when I began to think about the other way we think about cities. And we think about cities right now. If you came to Nairobi, the word gated communities is looked at something as it's something that's supposed to be good. But I guess that's what goes towards what Joe is talking about on a number of the things. Just look at it from an upper middle class perspective. And I wondered if everybody was in a gated community, then what would it mean for the space outside the gates in these very sections? But then also going to what Philip was talking about and looking at the spatial character of the small towns growing. This is Keroka. And I find Keroka interesting because all these are umbrellas and they are beginning to define the way the city wants to be. But I also thought that this was an economic sign because there's a lot of economics and there's a lot of economy going here. And one of the things that has happened is as we are fixated on the center, on the large urban centers like Nairobi, all the little agglomerations that are creeping in and coming together to join, as Philip said very well, are really where some of our thinking needs to happen. This is Kiraini, another small town. And I was asking, do we really begin to understand our streets and the spaces? Or this is a market in Sagana, another small town. And I would like to go back here again. This is 2020. I'd like to go back in 2025. By the time I did this, there was a single carriageway road. Right now, there's a dual carriageway road, and it is growing. And the agglomerations that Philip is talking about. This is Saika, which is lower income, not the lowest income, because we still have the slums to deal with, but this is a low income neighborhood in Nairobi. And this is when I began thinking about one of the things as planners we have we've stopped looking at, because most of these are on parcels that are 50 by 100 feet. That's maybe about 15 by 30 meters. Some of them get down to 33 by 66. They always follow those proportions of 40 by 80. But they're small parcel sizes which people can actually afford to buy, and which people can actually afford to begin a development which they build over time. And so you get this crazy fabric that's happening, and everybody, all the high-powered planners kind of do not like it. But I began thinking that if we really thought about how this works, we could begin to craft really how the city happens. And these can actually be attractive spaces. And I think I was creating similarities to the densities in Barcelona. And I think this is probably where my slides end, but it also goes to some of the work we do in KDI, Kunkai Design Initiative, where we interact with Slum Dwellers International a lot with Joe, in looking at a lot of participatory, we actually call it co-design, and just trying to think, what is the real template? What's the fabric that we can create, or rather the framework that we can create, and as Joe said, for everybody else to come and do their planning and their development around what they can afford, around what they can build, but at the same time, because it's a co-design process, showing them also how that affects the overall economy and the future growth of the city. And so those are some of the, I think I know there are many points I've forgotten, but I'm just trying to go fast. But those are some of the things that are really interesting and fascinating about this opportunity. When I lecture, a number of my students always start by writing urbanization almost as a problem. And I tell them to look at it as an opportunity, because I'm just fascinated to think that Nairobi will link to Kisumu. And we are beginning to see it happening, Philip. It was fantastic to put it that way. But I'm just thinking, what sort of opportunity are we creating there? How do we make sure we create that opportunity well, so that a number of the other things continue to exist? We bring in the fabric and bring in everybody, inclusive, up to and including the biodiversity. Yeah, for me, I'm a champion of cities. I'm a champion of, I think, what Joe was saying, slum upgrading, but I'm also a champion of learning by observation through sketching. I didn't know how much time I had. I think I had 10 minutes. I hope I've kept it to 10.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Arthur. I think this is really wonderful to hear your words, see your words in the imagery that you're documenting. Always a pleasure. So I wonder if Joe can join us with his video on as well. And I'd like to invite if there are any key questions from our colleagues online. If you wanted to raise a hand, welcome to unmute and ask a question to any of our provocateurs. Feel free if further questions emerge to write them in chat. Maybe just to come back, so Joe, you've remarked on the need for collaborative development of land use plans. You know, and I mean, you capture a very familiar statement that everyone's in their compartments, but cities don't work like that, and we know that, but yet we want to be safe in the simplicity of silos. So I wonder if you could describe the processes that you use to do this co-design. And I presume there has to be quite a lot of narrative work and trust building between the city and leaders in informal settlements. Maybe describe a few of those dynamics.
Yeah, definitely. Probably what I can share you through a joint process we underwent with Nairobi County. So we built evidence. From the evidence that we work with a number of academic institutions, Nairobi University, Manchester, and to build evidence. The evidence we built was for the county to declare the area is called Mukuru, to declare Mukuru as a special planning areas. There's so much right up around Mukuru's SPA, you can look it up. So what we did as an organization, we approached a number of civil society organizations, and we told them, look, you have your water tap, you have your toilet over here, you have your small project over here. This project will mean nothing if these communities are evicted. Then from the evidence, we were able to push the County of Nairobi to declare Mukuru an SPA. What is next after it was declared? The county came and said, we don't have the capacity. We have never undertaken a planning. This, we are talking about 685 acres of land. We are talking of populations of probably from 300 to 350,000 people. This is an industrial zone. Most of the land is gone. The people are squatting. They are squatters on private land. The city will tell you, we cannot bring investments or we cannot put infrastructure because this land is private. We will be sued. We cannot build schools. We cannot build hospitals. So we mobilized 40 institutions, civil society that were working within Mukuru. And the approach was, how do we work? How can we help? This is the city plan. And we are helping. We were addressing, for us, from the work that we do, we were addressing the issue of resisting evictions. We were addressing the issues of eviction, then it grew, it becomes now to a plan. So all these 40 organizations were able to support. The way we structured ourselves, the consortiums, they were structured within the county government's department. The planning department, the land department, the infrastructure, education, and health. And the directors of these departments of county, they were the consortium leads. So if it's Oxfam working on education, they were working under that. Concern working on education, organizations which were working on sanitation, they were working. So we developed that plan. But even before the plan was approved by county, we have MOUs that we have done. The plan, we mobilized the departments, the members of the county assembly to approve the plans that were made by this. It was a 2-year planning process. Somehow, the former president heard about something called the Mukuru Special Planning Area. He quickly formed something called the Nairobi Metropolitan Authority, put a general. So Mukuru became his pet project. So this is where so the 2 years, NMS came in, they improved the road network, the infrastructure, they put drainage, they brought water, they have put a level 2 hospital, and that led to something that we are calling social housing or affordable housing, which is not affordable at the moment. So it's a process. So to build trust, I agree, to build trust was a process. We mobilized 100 organizations. Some thought we had shitloads of money to give around, but when they had that, they bring in their skills, their resources, their expertise to support the county. Some of them walked away quietly. So that process of building trust, you have to make them see the sense. And again, whoever coordinates, so one of the things is that whoever coordinates, there to be a level of trust. So as much as we also acknowledge Mukuru SPA cannot be replicated in another city, but there are so many lessons bringing the consortiums together, civil society working with the city and academia. So the other thing that we raised the standard for community participation. The bar is we made sure at least there was adequate community participation in all the consortiums. Yeah. The other thing that we can get out of this, There are so many lessons that can be picked from Mukuru. So you can look at Mukuru SPA. There have been dozens of documentation around Mukuru. So as much as civil society, one of the things I see, everybody is comfortable doing their small little thing at their corner. Nobody wants to push the envelope. They want to be in their comfort zones. You want to plan to put a water kiosk that will provide water to 50 families. So for us, we push the envelope. We said, can we do this? We will continue. So we talk in Nairobi, we say Kibera is NGO country. Despite Kibera being an NGO county, has there been that significant change that you can see? From an outsider, you will say no. But for us, as much as we agree, the organization that is providing that tap, that toilet, is giving an opportunity to a child who probably might not have that chance. But I think there is so much power when we bring our resources together and we work at a city level. We plan at the city level.
No, I think that's a really fabulous provocation. I mean, it's not to diminish the fact that the interventions that people are making in the niches are important and are contributing, but how do you then get that to a transformative level? And I think these processes, you can't copy and then paste them from one context to another, but the underlying principles that you're remarking on, I think, are what we need to push. And again, it comes back to the work that we're trying to do, I think, collectively around narrative shift and how do you keep pushing this point. So it sounds often that we are saying the same things, but it's very important to keep that narrative alive. Philip, you mentioned governance, planning, and finance, which are the very familiar sort of levers for our cities. I think we've got an insight into some of the governance and trust building and pulling and leveraging and negotiating from Joe. I think a reflection on you on the effort that's going into setting up plans and how we then get financing to flow into these. And from what you're seeing from the partners you're working with and from the work that you're doing, how do we get that moving or working better?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I want to come back to Joe's intervention on the importance of getting rid of the silos and compartmentalized approach. And obviously, in the report we write about that, but in a way, what we see as a crucial stumbling block is the lack of strategy and vision. I mean, obviously, we talk about multi-level governance and participation and all that, but somehow we believe to get this really going as there is for governments and people to come together. And it's like, what should urbanization look like in 2050? You know, for some, it might be Dubai, for somebody else, is something else, but I think governments need to see the urban transition as a more fundamental development process. So it has to get to a higher policy agenda level, a more central level. And I think this also feeds into your question. So what do we need to get this going? So we need to empower the planning system. I mean, I'm not an urban planner, but it's like urban planning is a very powerful tool to change how a city looks like, how people live. This is something that we see obviously as crucial to make the wider policy actors understand of the opportunities that are there. And this comes to Arthur's points, which I really liked as well. It's like it's an opportunity, right? And often it's perceived as a problem because it hasn't been managed for so long. So the less you manage it, the more it becomes unmanageable. And then we add discussions on urbanization without industrialization, so aggravating the narrative around urbanization, right? This is something I think is also holding back like a stronger focus on how to deal with urbanization and really have like a big push on this agenda. And on the point of financing, for something that we found surprising doing the report is that beyond the more common knowledge on the problem that there are not enough resources and not enough resources at local level but there's also a big gap on data and information what things cost. It's like they're very, we have big figures on like the infrastructure gap is 100 billion, 200 billion. But if you look at detail, like there's really little data on what things cost in an urban setting in Kenya, in a small, low density area, in a big high density area. And just by getting better information on the cost, that also provides, opportunities for investors. They might be local, they might be international. So this is really something that we found surprising as a bottleneck. And I want to come back on the housing question, because this is also something that that where we see an opportunity for Africa. So at the OECD, the topic of the cost of living, especially housing, in OECD countries is a very prominent policy issue. So housing has become too expensive, right? And we had the Economist magazine publishing a big article on the big housing blunder, and terming it as the biggest economic policy mistake of the post-war era in OECD countries. And in a sense, it is saying that pushing into private housing ownership was the mistake. So what, it's like the private sector is not going to be able to provide all the housing that is needed for this urban transition. So what can Africa learn from past mistakes, and how can you adapt and envision the future of to the environmental reality, to people's realities. So I see a lot of opportunities, although the scale and the task is massive. So then we need, and I think in conclusion, it needs a higher policy anchorage. It has to be something more fundamental in the development agenda. It's like, what do we do with urbanization? Sorry for being a bit long.
No, thanks. And I mean, and you come back again to narrative. And I think, Arthur, you remarked while showing us one of your images, sort of this realization from yourself, we can't do this only as architects. And I think, yet what you are showing through what you're observing is that cities are transitioning, cities are being made themselves, regardless of grand plans, or in some cases what architects think. So maybe it's a personal sort of question, but sort of where have you found then your lever with the narratives that you're sharing through the sketching? And I think if I were to sort of sum up some of the points that have emerged so far, a lot of it is just back to what are these keywords that we keep returning to and keeping in focus. So where do you see your levers in this conversation? Where do you come from that realization?
I'll start from a point that I was really thinking about as Philip and Joe had been speaking, and it goes hand in hand with this, and it's maybe a provocation that you should consider at one point. And the thought has been crossing my mind: what is worse, a bad plan, well executed, or no plan at all? A bad plan, well executed, or no plan at all? And I think one of the key levers that I'm beginning to realize is, one, I first need to unlearn a lot, because I want to, and I always force this and say that Nairobi was a bad plan, well executed. And that's what resulted in slums, in a disproportionate utilization of the available land and resources and of serviced land. So it's a very difficult thing, even as designers and planners, that we need to go through to actually unlearn, so that we stop making bad plans. And there's one thing I know, as Joe is speaking, and I've looked a bit at Mkuru, and I'll look at it again. And it's also sparked some situations where people want to take the same idea of creating a special planning zone, but they're really doing it to exclude others. They are hoping that you could get a special. But the reason why it had to end up that way is because this was a situation which had been, and it's true of many of the slums, which had been excluded from planning ideas for so long. And most of the ideas really looked at them as raising it down and starting afresh with what they thought was a good plan, which in reality is a bad plan. So really, my lever right now is for a very simple structure, simple from the perspective of the designer, extremely complicated from the perspective of governance, finance, and especially legal ownership. But the simple thing is that you really need to understand how much infrastructure you need to provide and what makes sense for health and safety, and then kind of step out of the way and allow several other factors to come in. Joe mentioned 100 separate organizations, and it's just fascinating with the thousands of people coming in. And what happens while this place has been declared a special planning zone, it's not that nothing else is going on. There's still trade, there's still economy, there's still people are still living there and still going through the motions of life. And we have to remember that plans and cities are alive and moving. There's no point where we will have an opportunity to stop completely until everybody stops, the plan will proceed. So that's sort of been the painful learning for me, and one that I keep hoping to provoke. And every once in a while, when I catch somebody who realizes that all the things they're thinking about are probably wrong, and it hits a light bulb, I feel like, yes, we've made a step. And this will not be true of every city, because there are some African countries that have had urbanization for thousands and thousands of years. In the Kenyan coast, we did, but Nairobi and all those are very, very young towns. I like to say that majority of the great Western cities emerged before urban planning was a profession, I think in the 1920s. And if you consider that Nairobi is really, as a planned town, might be about 80 years, it really is just shortly after urban planning. So a lot of mistakes came through. So I think, yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that and hope that the provocation goes through.
Thank you so much for the provocation, and I think it aligns with this sense of, well, who's the planner, and while people, not to add complication to what you put, a bad plan executed well or no plan at all, but the sense of planning as a written document that's invested in by a legitimate government versus a plan that is enacted by the everyday footsteps of people, and that's what quite excites me about informal urbanism. And how we then legitimize that. And I think your point of provide the basics and the bulk infrastructure and then get out the way, because people in a way know what they want out of their spaces. Thank you very much to our three provocateurs. An hour goes by super quickly. This is the idea of these webinars, just a dose. We hope that we'll see each of our three colleagues and all of you who've joined us today at the full festival in May. Please do register for the mailers, where we'll be sending the digest from this meeting, but further links to further RISE activities. I see we've put these into the chat as well. Early bird tickets are available for sale by the 28th of February. But also for those who've attended previous RISE Africa festivals, for each one you've attended, there's 20% off. So if you've come to all of them virtually, that's a really nice ticket. Thank you so much for joining, and look forward to taking the conversations forward. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.